Putin's meeting with his national security strategy team to talk about Russia's deterrent strategy and its new nuclear employment plan. Just what we're talking about right now. Right now, the Russians are saying we're going to preempt America. Guys, chew on it. It's real. The Russians now are saying you got a preemption policy backed by preemptive weapons. So we're going to have a preemption policy too. So now the Russians are going to be forward-leaning, looking at us. And they're very nervous. You know what they're nervous about? Those Trident missiles with the W-76-1s coming out on a low reduced trajectory that can hit these sites within minutes of being launched. So they're hyper-vigilant for Trident missile launches. So they run a little war game. It involves the Baltics and the Russians. And NATO, Russia invaded. NATO kicked Russia's ass. And so Russia, wham, put a tactical nuke into the Baltics. Escalate! And what did we do? We fired a Trident missile equipped with W-76-2s into Russia, saying there, see, we managed this escalation.
Dear viewers, welcome back to another deep dive into the unfolding global chaos. Today we expose more of the West's hypocrisy. Yes, the same people who love to preach about democracy but consistently fail to live up to their own standards. And of course, Ukraine is once again in the spotlight as they continue to be sacrificed on the altar of NATO and Western interests. But here's what they won't tell you: the United States, NATO, and their allies keep saying the same tired thing: Russia will never win. Bold words, right? But let's face it, those words are getting shakier by the day. Even Inspector Scott Ritter has been outspoken about how the West's narrative on Ukraine has been misleading. He has repeatedly pointed out the realities of the battlefield, realities the Western media prefers to ignore. Before we dive in, let's not forget one important fact: this war isn't about Ukraine or democracy. Oh no, it's about saving the face of NATO and the West. They will drag this out as long as they can, sacrificing Ukraine's land, people, and future for their own egos. Let's talk about Jens Stoltenberg, the freshly retired NATO Secretary General. On October 1st, Stoltenberg gave what he probably hoped would be remembered as his grand farewell speech. He said NATO would fight to the bitter end, ensuring Ukraine regained every inch of its territory from Russia. He vowed that Russia would never win. NATO's support, he said, would last until every bit of land was back under Kyiv's control. Powerful words, right? They made headlines everywhere. But fast forward just 5 days to October 6th. Stoltenberg, fresh out of office, drops a bombshell: NATO might be okay with Ukraine giving up 10% of its territory to Russia in exchange for peace. That's right. This is the same Stoltenberg who just days before swore NATO would protect Ukraine's borders until the end of time. Now he's talking about slicing off a chunk of Ukraine, as if it's just a bad deal gone wrong. So let's break it down. Stoltenberg, the face of NATO, the man who assured us they'd fight for every inch of Ukraine, suddenly thinks it's fine to carve out 10% of Ukraine's land, probably the very regions that Russia now controls. What does that tell us? That all the tough talk we've been hearing for the last year was little more than smoke and mirrors. This is the same NATO that vowed to protect Ukraine, now hinting at a massive territorial compromise. So what happened to defending democracy? What happened to their promises? They're being shredded faster than anyone could have predicted. The harsh reality is this: NATO's leadership is backpedaling because they know Ukraine's chances of victory are slipping through their fingers. And what does this tell us about the so-called commitment of NATO and the West? That when the going gets tough, they're ready to fold. They're ready to sell out Ukraine, despite the countless promises made to the Ukrainian people. Now, speaking of the battlefield, let's see what's really happening on the ground, where Ukraine's situation is far more desperate than they would like to admit. Even Inspector Scott Ritter has repeatedly warned that Ukraine's military is crumbling, and the Western media is not telling the full story. His assessment is clear: the situation is dire, and the Ukrainian army is facing catastrophic losses. Let's talk facts, shall we? The Ukrainian front lines are not just under pressure, they're crumbling. The losses Ukraine is experiencing right now are catastrophic, and the situation is deteriorating rapidly. According to reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense, as of October 6th, over 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in the sea region alone. 20,000 soldiers, let that sink in for a moment. That's a staggering number by any military standard, but that's not all. Alongside those 20,000 soldiers, Ukraine has lost hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery systems, and other key equipment. Ukraine's ability to maintain any significant defense is evaporating, not slowly, but rapidly. It's like watching ice melt in the sun, except in this case, it's the Ukrainian military melting away. Now, the 123rd Brigade, a key Ukrainian unit, was ordered to reinforce positions at the Taurus front. This is where it gets even worse. Over 100 soldiers from that brigade outright refused the order. Think about it. This isn't a handful of soldiers having doubts. This is an entire battalion saying, no, we're not going. Why? Because they know it's a death trap. They know they're being sent into a fight they can't win. Let's be honest here. When your soldiers would rather face punishment for disobedience than fight on the front lines, you've got a serious morale problem. Ukraine's military isn't just losing equipment and territory, they're losing the will to fight. And that's the real nail in the coffin. How does Kyiv expect to turn things around when its own troops are saying, no more? At this rate, it's not a matter of if, but when Ukraine will collapse under the pressure. And NATO? Well, they're already planning for that, aren't they? But what's Ukraine's response to this collapse? Desperate times call for desperate measures, and their answer is to conscript 18-year-olds. Yes, you heard that right. Let's get into that. With the collapse of the Ukrainian military becoming more apparent, even Inspector Scott Ritter has noted that Kyiv's decision to mobilize 18-year-olds is a clear sign of desperation. When a nation begins conscripting teenagers, the situation has truly reached rock bottom. So, with morale at rock bottom, what's Kyiv's brilliant solution? Drafting teenagers. Ukraine is now looking at mobilizing boys as young as 18 years old to fill the gaps in their collapsing front line. Yes, these are young men who probably just finished school and now they're being sent straight to the battlefield. Imagine being 18 with no real training and suddenly thrown into one of the most brutal wars Europe has seen in decades. But let's be clear, conscripting these 18-year-olds isn't going to turn the tide of the war. It's a desperation move, plain and simple. Ukraine is running out of options, running out of soldiers, and running out of time. With 20,000 soldiers already dead in just one region, do they really think sending a wave of fresh recruits, many of whom probably don't even want to fight, will make a difference? It's tragic. But it's also clear that this is about delaying the inevitable. Even if they manage to scrape together a few thousand more soldiers, it's only a matter of time before they too are ground down by Russia's superior firepower and tactics. And the West? NATO? They're more than happy to let Ukraine throw these young men into the grinder. Because for them, it's not about winning, it's about keeping Ukraine in the fight long enough to weaken Russia. Ukraine is nothing but a pawn in this game, and now they're scraping the bottom of the barrel to keep it going. But the truth is, this isn't the first time NATO has played this dirty game. Let's turn back the clock and look at Operation Gladio, a perfect example of how the West undermines the very democracy it claims to defend. The observations made by Inspector Scott Ritter about the hypocrisy of the West don't just apply to Ukraine. History is full of examples where NATO's true agenda was never about democracy or freedom. Take Operation Gladio, for instance, NATO's secret Cold War operation designed not to defend democracy, but to sabotage it. This operation spanned across Europe, and its goal was simple: prevent any left-leaning or communist governments from coming to power, even if it meant toppling democratically elected leaders. In Italy, for example, Gladio's secret network played a direct role in suppressing the Communist Party, staging not one, but two coups to ensure Italy remained under the control of the Christian Democrats, who, by the way, were packed with fascist collaborators from World War II. In Greece, NATO backed fascists to stamp out leftist movements that had the support of millions. This is what NATO does in the name of defending democracy. This is the same NATO that now claims to be protecting democracy in Ukraine. The same organization that undermined democratic governments across Europe in the 20th century is now playing the same game in Eastern Europe. It's almost like they have a playbook for this, because they do. But the manipulation doesn't end there. Let's move to how this pattern of Western interference is still in full swing today, with Ukraine caught in the middle. If you think NATO's interference in Ukraine is a one-time thing, think again. This is part of a much larger pattern, one that has repeated itself for decades. From Operation Gladio to today's involvement in Ukraine, the West has always played the same game: destabilize countries, install puppet regimes, and call it democracy. The billions of dollars in military aid being sent to Ukraine aren't about helping the Ukrainian people. No, this is about weakening Russia. Ukraine is just a pawn in a much larger geopolitical game. But here's the truth: NATO doesn't want you to hear Ukraine can't win, not with all the money and weapons in the world. And NATO knows this. That's why they're already planning for a post-war landscape where Ukraine loses territory, loses soldiers, and loses its sovereignty. In the end, Ukraine isn't fighting for democracy or independence. They're fighting to stay alive in a war that was never theirs to win. The West has promised them the world, but just like in Italy and Greece, those promises will amount to nothing when the dust settles. But let's conclude by taking a final look at where this all leads, because the end game for Ukraine is already clear. So, where does this all leave us? Ukraine's fate is sealed. The front lines are collapsing, morale is in free fall, and even NATO's top brass are already preparing for Ukraine to lose. They're talking about conceding 10% of Ukraine's land. And it's not because they want peace, it's because they know Ukraine has no chance of winning. Even Inspector Scott Ritter has said this war is a losing battle for Ukraine. His words are a stark reminder of how disconnected the West's promises are from the reality on the ground. The endgame is here. NATO is ready to sacrifice Ukraine, just as they've sacrificed other nations in the past. The only question is how long the West will drag this out before they finally admit the truth. For the Ukrainian people, one can only hope the suffering ends sooner rather than later. Until then, we watch the West continue its cynical game, knowing full well the outcome was decided long ago. Thank you for tuning in. If you found this deep dive insightful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more updates. Stay informed, and remember, what you're not being told is often the most important part of the story.